Hello and welcome to Practical Inclusion for Tuesday, which falls after a long weekend for us in Victoria. So for those of you who are starting your week, welcome, and those who are already a bit way through it, welcome to you as well. If you're tuning in on Facebook or LinkedIn live, please feel free to write comments, questions for us. We love the discussions that are going on. And also, if you're watching the replay, please feel free to do that as well. I want to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I broadcast from today, which is the land of the Wadawurrung people, and pay my respect to their elders, past, present and emerging. And a particular shout out, I suppose, to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, as we've just passed through International Women's Day. And I saw some articles that were highlighting the lack of Indigenous voices that seem to be across the plethora of events that have been run, but there were also some fantastic events that certainly did feature Indigenous women. So hopefully we'll see a lot more of that in the future, because I think that's it's a real oversight if you have an event that doesn't contain an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice in Australia when it comes to International Women's Day. Jane, I will get you to tell your story and introduce yourself in a second, but firstly, whose land do you broadcast in on from today?
Yeah, I'm on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation here in sort of the inner part of Melbourne. And I too would like to pay my respects to their elders past and present and acknowledge the ongoing and continuing connection of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to our land in this country that we now call Australia.
Great, thank you very much. So Jane, I've known you for a little while now, and I know you've tuned into a couple of these lives yourself. So I'd love you to tell your story. What brought you to inclusion work? As the advertisement showed, you are Head of Diversity and Inclusion at Xero currently. So what brought you to that role, to this work? And a little bit, anything more about your story that you want to share with us here today?
Thanks, Bree, and thanks for asking me along today. I think it's an interesting story, probably a slightly unusual one. So I've been in this role since middle of 2019. I started in the role in an acting capacity and then job shared it for about a year with the fabulous woman, Bindi Edelman, who's now at Afterpay. But how I came to get there in the first place is a little bit different. I at the time was working in the legal team at Xero, which I'd been in for about a year. And I'd worked with Bindi from the sort of corporate governance side as she thought about things like our measurable objectives for diversity. So we knew each other reasonably well and knew that we got on particularly well. And at a certain point in 2019, I'd resigned from my role at Xero, my legal role, and let them know that I was going to go away and do some study. And I decided it was time to figure out what I actually wanted to be when I grew up, having reached my 40s, and thought I am actually not really cut out to be a lawyer for the rest of my life. There is more to me than this. And while I was sort of in my notice period, I got a tap on the shoulder from Bindi and our then Chief People Officer, Rachel Powell, who's now our Chief Customer Officer, asking if I would step in to Bindi's role for a few months while she needed to take some leave. I think my jaw hit the floor, but then it was followed by the words, "Would you trust me?" And they assured me that they would. And I thought, well, this is an incredible opportunity. I would, love to have a go in this space. And that's really how I came to be. But the irony of all of this for me is that it actually feels like the closing of a very long circle that goes all the way back to being a young person thinking about what I wanted to do with my life. And the reason I chose law was because of my belief at the time in using law as a vehicle for social change and for social justice. And somewhere along the path, I got diverted from that goal, but it does kind of feels like the loop somehow closed by coming into this work. I feel incredibly grateful to have had the opportunity to lead this space with Xero, to work with Bindi, and really to understand inclusion from the inside, which is an incredible place to be, as I now look to actually go and embark on that study that I was thinking about all the way back in 2019.
Fantastic. And I so relate to that kind of circle journey. of coming back to what you feel most passionate about, and that you want to create social change and be a part of social change. It's something that I can certainly relate to, having gone and done other things as well. You describe, falling into this work, and the amount of times that I hear people say exactly the same thing, and my journey is similar as well. That it's people often come to me and they ask me, and they book mentoring sessions with me to work out how they might create themselves a career in diversity and inclusion. And by far, what I've seen is that people do get internal job moves or promotions or sideways moves, or sometimes, as in my case, actually drop pay grade to take on a diversity and inclusion role. And it seems to be the most common way that people get into this work. Is that the experience that you've had? I know you know a lot of people working in this space as well.
You definitely hear that a lot, and I think often people are transferring in with other skills that they bring to the space. It's quite interesting because Bindi was also a lawyer before she moved into diversity and inclusion, but interestingly came from an employment law background, whereas my background was in sort of more corporate governance and corporate law. So for us, it actually was like a match made in heaven, because we've got these two quite different and yet complementary perspectives. But I do also reading a great article by the fabulous Aubrey Blanche, who I think is now at Culturant, but at the time was writing when she was at Atlassian. And I think she was writing an article, I don't know if you've seen it, Bree. She was speaking directly to people who might be keen to move into this space. And one thing that she reminded people was that sometimes it's important to think about whether you've actually got the ability to make change where you are in your role, and not always feel like you have to move into a designated D&I role to have the impact that you want to have. And I think sometimes we underestimate the fact that we need people inside our businesses to actually be the ones who are leading and driving change from their position as in the business, and not to absolutely, our roles are incredibly important as thought leaders, as centres of excellence, as consultants effectively, but also to remind people that you can make a difference from where you are in your organisation as well.
That is such a good point. And I also think from that other perspective too, around, quite often it is people from marginalised or minority or disadvantaged groups or communities that gravitate towards these type of roles. And sometimes you're like, I just wish you had have kept going and become the CEO, because that actually ticks out, that brings diversity to leadership.
Bree, hasn't there been quite a lot of commentary in recent times about who has been being moved into some of these newly created roles that we've seen, particularly in the States post Black Lives Matter? And exactly that comment that, are we losing, amazing talent from historically underrepresented backgrounds into sort of these roles which don't necessarily have an obvious pathway to being the CEO, which is, so for me, that was an interesting reflection.
Yeah, I think absolutely. And I think also there's the trap that it is assumed because you have lived experience of exclusion that you understand how to do diversity and inclusion work. And that can put, great expectations on people that they're not actually able to fulfill or deliver on. And it is not the right role for everybody. And particularly if, as I'm sure we might get to talk to some of it, it's challenging also on a personal level, not just a work level, and many times. And it certainly takes a certain ability to switch off and take the emotion out a little bit from the work, but also then be able to put it in when it's required as well. So it can be quite challenging from that space. So maybe if we talk about that, because today, I thought that would be great for us to be really talking about careers in this space, because it has become such a hot topic. I know you participated in the first cohort of my inclusive leadership course when the idea was that I'd be training people within organisations doing other roles about how they can be inclusive leaders. But predominantly the people who've been attracted to that course are those who want to get into the diversity and inclusion space. So can you talk us through a bit about, what it's like to have the role that you have currently? What do you find most rewarding about it? But also, what are the key challenges and what makes it really difficult at times as well?
Yeah, great question. So at the moment, I am in a global role. Xero's employees across about 8 countries at the moment. And so there's, quite a lot of challenge just from thinking globally while ensuring that everything we do is appropriate locally as well and meaningful locally too. So I think that's one of the key challenges of a role like this. I know, so obviously some diversity and inclusion roles are more, regionally focused or functionally focused. And I was just actually recently unpicking and having a look at Netflix's structure, because they have about 17 people working in the inclusion space there. And interesting to see how they're fairly functionally aligned with different parts of their business, and that as a potential structuring model, I think has a lot of merit to it. I think that one of the things that I find most rewarding in this space is definitely when somebody reaches out and sends a message, or you see a comment pop up in one of our inclusion polls, and you can really feel that sense that someone's felt included and valued and respected by something that you've had some part to play in. And I guess it is very personally rewarding on that level, and also to start to hear the conversations shifting inside the organisation as well, and see the thinking change, and that takes time and is slow work. So I think that's the other thing I'd say is a big challenge, is that we tend to want things to go faster than they do. And sometimes that can be quite frustrating, because, you like to be able to wave the wand and have the world look the way that we think it should. And we realise there's actually a lot of work involved to get there, rather than it being something that we can wave the magic wand over.
Yeah. And do you think that, I've found that challenge for me it's been like this long learning curve of how to have patience and how to look for, rather than heading down this path to get the answer, finding the thousands of other paths that you might be able to use to get to the same spot. And that problem solving element, how important do you think that is in this work?
I think it is very important. I think flexibility in this role is incredibly important. And as you say, understanding that there are many paths to an outcome, sometimes unexpected ones too. So, things that perhaps you think have gone to sleep or on the back burner can suddenly come back to life in unexpected ways. I think we had an example of that with a conversation that I remember stretching right back to my early days in the role. Actually, in 2019, someone raised with me the question of having all gender toilet spaces in our offices. And we talked through that, and we raised some questions with our internal facilities team. And, it was kind of the right noises were made, but it really went to sleep for quite a long period of time. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, it popped up again, actually through our creative design group, which we call the hub internally, suddenly popped out and said, "Oh, we're doing some work on some signage for all gender toilets." And I went, "Oh, okay, that's exciting." So we then reconstituted sort of a little group of a group to consult around that and to think about what we wanted and what that should look like. And then we finally rolled it out late last year. And it was just like one of those things that felt like it was such a simple thing to do, and it is, and yet it felt like it was never going to happen, but finally it did. But not perhaps by the route that I initially expected it to happen by.
And that can be so frustrating. It can't it, as you say, you see something that seems so simple to change and is so important to people, but
Absolutely.
sometimes the best approach is to just sit back and let it sit for a bit till it comes back around again.
Although that's hard, isn't it? Because then you sort of feel like, there's someone's come to you and said, this is troubling me in my daily life. I find I constantly have to think about which bathroom I'm using. And, it's not something anyone should have to worry about on the daily basis. So kind of to sit back is actually quite hard, because you're conscious that someone is feeling something that is not a good thing on a daily basis. But sometimes I think you do also have to recognise that there are going to be mountains you can climb, quite rapidly and quite effectively. And sometimes you do just have to let the organisation work its way to the right place in its own time.
Yeah, well said. Absolutely. Can you tell us, and I think that might be kind of one of them, but what would you, out of your time in this role, what would you say has been the most satisfying achievement?
That is definitely one of them. And I know it's such a small thing, but it really is like, yay, tangible results. Awesome. Do you know, another one that I was really proud of, I was reflecting when you asked me to think about this topic, was, funnily enough, something that came through our inclusion poll that we ran. We run an inclusion poll every 6 months, and there's some feedback, so verbatim feedback that comes through that, as well as a metric that we see. And we just launched our revamped parental support policy in October last year. And quite it was a big undertaking, certainly not one that I was only instrumental in. There was a huge group of people involved in it. But definitely one of the parts I was focused on was how we expressed the application of the policy and made sure that we called in everybody who might otherwise read themselves out of the policy. In fact, that great piece of research has just popped out from Grace Papers and Pride and Diversity today, reminding us of that exact point, that particularly for people, from rainbow families, you really need to be expressly including rather than assuming people will think they are part of it. So we worked really hard on the language in the policy to make sure that it felt that hopefully it came across inclusively in the way it was intended. And then I did see some feedback pop up in the inclusion poll, someone who wrote, "I'm a gay dad and I've never felt so included by a parental leave policy." And that honestly gave me the happy shivers. That's like, right, that's what we want. We want exactly the outcome we were after. And I was really proud of that.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's great. And it's that, I always feel actions like that, when you're actually changing language and policy to explicitly include, they're not only so beneficial from the user's perspective, but it's also the message it sends throughout the organisation that this is the standard, that we're setting this bar, and this is what this organisation values and respects, and it's the lay of the land. And you find, I don't know if you saw Vic Health, I think they've done it 2 years now, and I'm not sure if they were doing it beforehand, but they had a seminar not so long ago where they had some researchers looking at the type of language and communication messages that you need to use to bring people along with you on the, I think for them, a gender equity journey. And I love the fact that they've managed to find that, I can't remember the exact numbers, but say it's 20%, or I think it's even less, maybe 10% of the population are the unmovables, essentially. They're the people that aren't going to come with us. It doesn't matter what kind of messages you provide to them, they're going to stick their heels in harder and not come along on the journey. But there was a very large, and then there's of course those of us who are already converted, but then there's this really large group in the middle that they actually term the persuadables. And
love it.
Really love that language, because it's the majority of the population who are really well-intentioned. They're good people. They are totally on board with this stuff, but they just don't know enough about it to know what they should do, or why they would need to do anything, or why you would need to specifically call that out in a policy. It applies to them anyway. Like, why wouldn't they feel included? I really like to keep that in my mind when doing this work, that, I think it was almost 80% of the population are persuadables. So if we use the right language, and if we put the right things in policy and practice, then they'll come along with us. They're not going to be too hard.
That's really interesting, Bree. And I think, and interestingly, since I came and did your inclusive leadership training, which was fabulous, and gave me lots of inspiration, we actually, you can pay me later, not joking, it was really fabulous. We have created our own internal inclusive leadership training, because we realised, it all coalesced, I think, during the early part of COVID, when we realised that we had leaders who were remotely leading physically distributed teams for the first time, and that was throwing up a whole range of different challenges around well-being, connection, belonging, lots and lots of different things. But so probably my other really thing that I found really rewarding was creating that training over the back half of last year. We piloted it in sort of November. And we're now rolling it out across the organisation. But the reason I bring it up in connection to your piece about the persuadables is that the perspective that we've taken on this is to say we want to make sure that all people leaders at Xero are effectively on the same page about what we see as important in terms of being an inclusive leader. And so I'm glad to hear, is what I really am trying to say, is that 80% are persuadable. Because sometimes, you know, for many of the people who do our inclusive leadership training, there are that group that are already converted, who know everything about this, are really on top of it and doing a great job. But for a lot of people, it actually is something that's a new thing for them to think about. And so, you know, we obviously try and bring them along on the journey. But yeah, I'm encouraged that there is a group that we should be able to reach.
There is, and what I think too is you see, and you know, obviously the people in that training too, who's sometimes we do get the message wrong or we get the approach wrong, and they do get the heckles up and they get defensive and they call it PC, whatever, and they do find that it you know, they talk about reverse discrimination and they come up with this kind of backlash, sometimes subtle, sometimes not so subtle. But it's nice to remember that it's actually just that we've got it wrong. We've got our approach with them wrong. It's not necessarily that they're awful people and they don't want to see equality. They just don't understand enough about what equality looks like and what we need to do to get there. So yeah, I love that you've done that program. I just think it's such a positive thing. And create change in the organisation ongoing. That's kind of a legacy that you can leave there.
That's absolutely does feel a bit that way. But as we say to everyone in that training too, it's, you know, that idea of throw out the concept of the role model as the perfectly formed finished product as well. So really engage in the idea of the role model as the work in progress. And I still feel very much, you know, 2 years down the track from starting this role, like the work in progress is still going, but the learning curve has been like that. And, you know, it's amazing.
Yeah, fantastic. All right, well, because it was International Women's Day yesterday, I think we should at least touch on that a little bit. Maybe if I run with it like this, what are your major concerns about this year's International Women's Day and what gave you hope or inspiration?
It's a really interesting backdrop for International Women's Day, everything that's been swirling around in our media in the last couple of weeks. You know, I was actually, there was an article in the ABC I saw yesterday and I actually wrote some of the numbers down because I was still struck by them. Like, so these are the things that they called out there when we think about some of our top 200 companies in Australia. We've still got 82 boards that haven't achieved 30% representation of women. We've only got 21 female chairs and we've only got 10 female CEOs. And that's the stuff that makes my head just explode in 2021. And they were really connecting that back to the idea that if we have environments in which harassment, discrimination continue to be allowed to flourish unchecked, then we just aren't going to get where we need to go. So that's the parts that really absolutely frustrate and concern me. And I did see a great piece on LinkedIn from another awesome woman who wrote, it's a bit sad to think that we still need to challenge to get change, around that theme of choose to challenge. So that's the bits that are frustrating. Hopefully, was really watching our internal panels, which were populated with women who were either leaders of people at Xero, not our most senior leaders deliberately, or leaders in their field, and listening to them talk and thinking that that is the future that sits out in front of us. And our male allies on those panels who also were able to speak eloquently to their understanding of how to be a good ally to women in our organisation. So, you know, the good and the bad. What about you, Bree?
Yeah. No, I like how you've called out that choose to challenge, that still needs to be a thing. And yet, I don't know what you've experienced, but I've had so many people in the last probably 3 months tell me and remind me how far we've come. And it's this rhetoric, we've come so far, you know, you can't change everything in a day. You're like, you are completely ignoring the history of activism that's occurred. We are still having this conversation how many decades, if not centuries later.
Yes.
I think we have to have mottos like choose to challenge, because people aren't choosing to. And I don't understand why so many people, I know it feels safe and it feels more comfortable to assume that everything is equal and we can move on from these conversations, but as you say, the backdrop shows that is clearly so far from the truth. And we do need to get, we need more than those who are just already doing the daily grind and constantly speaking up about things. We just need more allies to jump on board and create equality across the whole board, not just for women.
Yes. Agree.
So that has been really, I think what's, the thing I'd take is probably that flip side too. The positive is that I've seen more women really arc up and motivate and start being much more vocal and proactive about this in the last couple of weeks than what I'd seen previously. And it shouldn't be the women's job to be doing that. We'd like to see so many more men and people of other genders have been fighting the fight for a long time, but to see more men jump into this space and really push forward and amplify the voices of the women who are already in this space. I think that's been a positive thing to see, that more women have gotten angry, and it's awful. That's had to be the result of it, but more women are vocally angry, and that needs to happen if we're going to create change.
Yeah, there's been some really great, strong voices out there this year from a whole range of quarters. And in fact, even on our panel, we had these two panels. One was for our Southern Hemisphere, one was for the Northern Hemisphere, because being such a large organisation, we also have to really think about time zone inclusion, which is an aspect of inclusion that perhaps people don't necessarily trip over every day if you've got an Australian-based business. But listening to some pretty powerful stories on that panel, and the fact that people felt safe, psychologically safe in our environment, to say, well, this happened, and in fact it happened in my interview process here at Xero, and I know it should have been different. It was pretty amazing.
It's that empowerment piece, isn't it? That's fantastic to see, kind of gaining some momentum.
Interestingly, though, we also had the conversation about are we constantly, are we placing too much emphasis on what women need to do to thrive in the environment versus what does the environment need to do in order to support women and people of other gender identities? And I think that's a really important part of the conversation as well.
Oh, absolutely. And I couldn't agree more. I think we're still seeing way too many solutions to the gender equality issue is fixing the women and leadership programs and mentor programs. And I know I harp on about this so ad nauseum, but it frustrates me. You point out that change in policy wording, like that's the stuff that is going to create more change. There's no point just taking a couple of individuals and building up their skill set if they're still going to face massive barriers along the way that are, take a superhuman to jump over. So
absolutely.
No, with you. Well, we've come to our time. I knew that would be an incredible conversation, and I'm so glad that you were able to share that with us, and that we could have this conversation together, particularly on this week. So thank you so much for joining me, Jane, and I wish you well with your studies.
Thank you.
And
thank you for having me.
Yeah, that's all good. Thanks to everybody for listening in and for your comments. I will put this up on YouTube, as I usually do, with captions. I know Facebook runs automatic captions and they're awful. I'm sure they're improving them, but it does need a bit of editing. So if you do need the captions, head over to YouTube tomorrow and they'll be edited and ready for you. And I'll be back again next week for another episode. So again, I've loved the suggestions that people have had about topics and speakers. So if you've got a topic that you'd really love me to delve into, or a particular guest you'd like me to have on, then please send that through to me, and I'd love to accommodate and keep the conversation going. Thank you, everyone. Bye.